Good afternoon. It may look like we're starting, but we're not really starting. I'm Mark Green, and I have some tasks to do first. And our first panel of Ted Sorensen and Jonathan Alter and Michael Eric Dyson will be up in 2 minutes. This is being taped for broadcast on Air America Radio, and so I'm the equivalent of Jon Stewart trying to juice up the crowd with jokes, although you'll see soon why I'm very different from Jon Stewart. I have to tape 4 things better now than when the program is started, so just bear with me. You're watching the baloney being made. Welcome back to Authors Turning the Page, coming to you from the Denver Democratic Convention on Air America. My name is Mark Green, and our panelists today are Ted Sorensen, Michael Eric Dyson, and Jonathan Alter. We're back at the Air American Progressive Book Club event at the Big Tent in Denver. Hold your applause, please, until I'm done. Third, and there are 4 of these, you're listening to Authors Turning the Page, our panel discussion from the Democratic National Convention in Denver. We'll be back in a minute with more of our panelists, Ted Sorensen, Michael Eric Dyson, and Jonathan Alter. I'm Mark Green. Stay with us. Last. Stay with us for more from the Air American Progressive Book Club event at the Democratic Convention in Denver. Special thanks to our event sponsor, Green Mountain Coffee Roasters Foundation. That's it. At this time, I'd like, please, anybody could do it apparently. At this time, I'd like Jonathan Alter to come. I'd like Jonathan, you all to welcome our first panel, Jonathan Alter, Ted Sorensen, Michael Eric Dyson, and Rachel Maddow. Have a seat. Everybody without crutches, jump up onto the stage. Ted and Michael, please join us.
We've set up an obstacle course backstage, unfortunately.
Rachel, I'll switch with you when you're speaking, and then you. Thank you all for coming. I'm Mark Green, president of Air America Radio, and you know you have a big bureaucracy when my assignment is to welcome the welcomer. Rachel Maddow, for those of you who have not been reading the newspapers or listening to radio in the last month especially, is a Rhodes Scholar, an AIDS activist, the author next year of a book on military affairs. Oh yes, her day job is as the host of the popular Rachel Maddow show on Air America, 6 to 9 Eastern Time. Oh, and September 8th, starting the host of the oddly similarly named show, the Rachel Maddow Show on MSNBC. Her doubleheader is great for America and for Air America. Welcome, Rachel Maddow.
Thank you very much, Mark. We think it's going to be called The Rachel Maddow Show. We don't yet know. I just want to say how freaking awesome it is to be in Denver and how much fun everybody's having despite all the logistical hurly-burly and the heat and everything else. It's been a great time so far, and it's going to be a spectacular week. So thanks to everybody in the midst of what has been so much fun with so many opportunities already to make time to come out and come to this very cool event. So thank you for being here. I am going to be joining MSNBC's primetime coverage tonight in about 30 seconds. So that is why I am not staying longer than I'm going to. But I do feel like it's worth at an event like this, when things move so fast and there are so many people who are taking the opportunity to make their points and make their contribution to the definition of the Democratic Party and what this presidential election means, to recognize that on the right there is a sort of vast, well-funded infrastructure of think tanks and research facilities and advocacy groups that essentially pay people to write about right-wing politics and pay people to think big thoughts about right-wing politics. And then they've got a pretty well-oiled machine to get those ideas translated into electoral politics. On the left, what the left has is brilliant authors. And what the left is starting to have, and has had in Yeoman's work for a generation, is a small but badass progressive media. And it is the left and right are not mirror images of one another in America in terms of how our institutions work. But what the left and the vibrant center in American politics has is great authors. And what better time during a week like this to think some big thoughts, not only about where we've come from, but where we're going. So, all that said, I'm actually going to introduce now the moderator of today's panel, who is Mark Green. Mark Green is my boss. He is the president not only of Air America Radio, but of Air America Media, which is supposed to one step on the way to Air America Omnimedia when we get as big as Martha Stewart. In Mark's other life, he is the author or editor of 21 books on public policy issues. His most recent is called Losing Our Democracy, which came out this past year. I do have a bit of a scoop to give you. First public pronouncement about the fact that Mark is now collaborating with the Center for American Progress on a major presidential transition book and a citizens transition book. It's called A Progressive Blueprint. It's to be published by Basic Books. It's due to come out around the time of the inauguration, and it is an ambitious and smart and cool idea, which is a progressive agency by agency comprehensive critique of the American government. And it is designed for the use of the next president, of America's 44th president. And that is due out around inauguration time, which is very exciting. So, and that's your scoop, because that's never been publicly announced before. So thank you all for coming to Denver. Thank you all for being part of this great festival ideas, and thank you for coming today. Thanks.
We apologize for Rachel's absence, but when you have 2 day jobs, she has to go on air and she's irreplaceable. I am replaceable here on the panel, but she is irreplaceable. So thank you, Rachel. I want to ask Lauren Strayer, by the way, to bring my folder from the green room next door, which has the 2 minute, 1 minute, and no minute left signals for our panelists on the first, second, and third panel, since we're taping this to time for broadcast on radio, and to give away something. It's 37 minutes an hour, and you can guess what the rest of the hour is comprised of. We're really grateful that you all have come. This is a week, of course, to say the least, of politics. We wanted to inject some policy into the politics. And so what we have done is gather together, in our view, the greatest array of progressive authors since Ted Sorensen dined alone in the White House mess in 1962. Now, Ted will know that's a direct steal of JFK's joke. Was it about Pablo Casals? I can't remember. Thomas Jefferson dining alone in the White House. Which, of course, that probably was a line that John Kennedy stole from Ted Sorensen, so it's only fitting that I apply it to him. The idea is that we will have 3 panels of prominent authors, each taking insight or insights from their most recent books and applying it to the 2008 presidential election in 5 to 7 minutes. This will be live radio. And the panels are basically past, current, and future. The second panel is of the unending, continuing fight between left and right, progressive and conservative, future and past, an ideological tug-of-war that hasn't and won't end. And that will be moderated by Tom Hartman, who actually is the host of the popular Tom Hartman Show, 12 to 3 Eastern Time on Air America. Tom is the author or editor, believe it or not, of 29 books, including most prominently The Last Hours of Ancient Sunlight, which will be reissued in new form this year. The third panel will be on what's next. That once this extreme administration is truly history, how do we dig ourselves out of the deep hole they dug us into on international affairs, on domestic affairs, on the economy, and legal justice in America? That will be moderated by Anne Marie Slaughter, who is the dean of the Woodrow Wilson School at Princeton University, the author last year of The Idea That Is America, and those two moderators will be introducing their panels as they come up. At the end of this panel, I'm going to ask Elizabeth Wagley, who's the CEO of the Progressive Book Club, the co-host of this event, to join Charlie Kirker, the chairman of the board of Air America, the other co-host of the event. We thought you needed 3 welcomes because there were 3 panels. Let me introduce the panelists right in a row, then ask them to speak and hand the mics between themselves one by one. First will be Ted Sorensen, a well-known intimate of John Kennedy for 11 years, from his years as United States freshman senator from Massachusetts through November 22nd, 1963. Ted then became a prominent international lawyer at the Paul Weiss Rifkin law firm in New York. Most recently has written a terrific autobiography I had the pleasure of reading called Counselor. Second will be Jonathan Alter, a senior journalist and columnist at Newsweek, who has written another wonderful book. I have not read one of the 3 books because, Michael, I only got it yesterday because it's not yet out. But Jonathan Alter's book is the defining moment about FDR's first 100 days. And third and last is Michael Eric Dyson, a frequent commentator on cable shows, a professor at Georgetown University, and the author of a book about to be released called April 4th, 1968. The Martin Luther, oh, it's already out? April 4th, 1968, Martin Luther King's death and how it changed America. Please welcome as our first speaker, Ted Sorensen.
Thanks, Mark. The fulfillment of the, hello, you can hear me? Fulfillment of the biblical prophecy, the halt leading the blind. I'm here because, no, the mic is not on. You can probably hear me anyway. Is this better?
Yeah, talk right into
All right. Okay. I remember very clearly, and about 50 years ago, John F. Kennedy and I were out west during the time that we were going to every one of the 50 states. He spoke in a hotel ballroom. The mic did not work. He put it aside, saying Daniel Webster spoke to 15,000 people from a hillside in Massachusetts. I ought to be able to do this without a mic. So I'll try to do mine without a mic if this one fails. My book is about my life. The subtitle is A Life at the Edge of History. And that history includes my 11 years with John F. Kennedy. And there could be no sharper contrast than the presidency and principles of John F. Kennedy with those of Bush and Cheney and John McCain. If I could read, I would read to you one page from the book in which I note that the single best and, in my opinion, most important speech that John F. Kennedy ever gave was not his inaugural address. It was his commencement address at American University, in which he called for the first time for a re-examination of the Cold War, a re-examination of our relations with the Soviets, a re-examination of what we mean by peace. And I go on to point out that that was a particularly intensely productive period for John F. Kennedy. That speech was given on June 10, 1963. The day before, in Honolulu, he had spoken to the American Conference of Mayors, asking for their help on putting civil rights into effect throughout their cities and throughout the country. That same afternoon, he signed the Equal Pay Act, which required equal pay for women to the same pay being received by men in the same jobs. The next day, from the Oval Office, he coordinated, so to speak, the desegregation of the University of Alabama with its first 2 African American students in history, despite George Wallace's vow to stand in the doorway. That evening, he went on the air and on nationwide radio and television, delivered the most far-reaching civil rights speech since Abraham Lincoln in calling for the elimination of all discrimination and segregation on the basis of race and color in this country. 1 week later, he sent to the Congress the most comprehensive civil rights legislation in the 20th century. Later, in that same month, he announced the establishment of a communications link between the Kremlin and Washington, the so-called hotline that would prevent nuclear war by accident or misunderstanding in the future. By a week or 10 days later, he was in Berlin after crisscrossing Germany to try to rebuild and reassure the Western Alliance, which was concerned that he might be seeking some kind of peace with the Soviet Union behind its back. And that trip culminated in Berlin, where he gave one of his most beloved and famous speeches, concluding, "Ich bin ein Berliner," to identify with, to encourage the citizens of West Berlin, and predicting as he did that in time the wall would come down and that Berlin and all of Europe, East and West, would be reconciled again. Think about the contrast on each of those issues: civil rights, equality for women, peace in the world, communications with those who may be hostile toward us. The contrast between the approach that John F. Kennedy exhibited during that short time and what we've been through during these last 8 years, what we will go through again, if we fail to elect Barack Obama, who's going to be nominated this week. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mark. I'm honored to be part of the program today, and especially to follow Ted Sorensen, who I think by common consensus is the greatest presidential speechwriter who ever lived, you know, I'm in a business where words matter, and a lot of times in the presidency, not only do you use words as we've learned recently with Barack Obama's success to move a nation and elevate the debate, but if you're fortunate enough to become president, words then structure a lot of the priorities of what happens in government, and the policymakers follow on with the speeches. And Franklin Roosevelt's words were immensely important in restoring hope and faith in our democratic process. And I argue in my book, actually saving both capitalism and democracy at their moments of greatest peril in early 1933, when 3/4 of the banks were already closed before Roosevelt took office. There was a lot of concern that maybe we'd be on a barter economy for a long time. People thought, is this the end of capitalism? Is this the end of democracy? The word dictator actually had a positive connotation. It's hard to believe there was even a car made by Studebaker called the Dictator. It sold pretty well. Roosevelt stepped in and was able to restore hope and, more important in a long-term sense, redefine the social contract between the American people and their government. Redefine what we owe each other as a people. But I want to take a moment before explaining that a little further to tell you a little bit about Franklin Roosevelt, the candidate, and some things that are a little bit less flattering about him. I tried to paint a warts and all picture in my book. And the reason I want to do this is because earlier this year during the FISA debate, a couple of months ago, there were a lot of progressives who decided they'd kind of had it with Barack Obama. You know, he wasn't all he was cracked up to be. He wasn't a real progressive. And you still hear that sometimes from people on various issues where they feel he's tacked too much to the center. And I think there's a little bit of an unthinking assumption that the real progressives, the people like Franklin Roosevelt, were true blue progressives, and they were progressives all the time. And nothing, I assure you, could be further from the truth. You know, early in the 1932 campaign, Franklin decided to pander to William Randolph Hearst, who was very much against the League of Nations. And Roosevelt had run for vice president in 1920, primarily on a pro-League of Nations platform. He flip-flopped. He was for the League of Nations before he was against it. In order to pander to Hearst, Eleanor wouldn't speak to him for a week. She was so angry that he was, kissing up to this powerful newspaper publisher who wanted him to use the word American more in his speeches. And then on the issue of prohibition, which was very big at the time, FDR was neither a wet, for being able to drink, nor a dry. He was a damp. He straddled. Leave it up to the states. And there were a lot of progressives who thought he was, in those days they called it trimmer and a flip-flopper. And he didn't say an awful lot during the 1932 campaign. He had no blueprint for the New Deal. One of his aides said to say it was a plan of action would be to say that the broken bats and old pennants that had been put in a little boy's, that were in a little boy's bedroom had been put there by an interior decorator. There was no design to the New Deal. He had a brain trust, but they were just beginning to develop some policy ideas. And when Herbert Hoover, his opponent, called him a chameleon on plaid, it wasn't necessarily off the mark. At one point, he gave a speech on trade during the 32 campaign, and he had, as he often did, he pit his aides against each other. He had one pro-trade, pro-free trade speech, and another more protectionist speech. And his aide, Ray Moley, came and said, well, which one, should we give? And he just very dismissively said, weave them together, Ray. Yeah, so this is how FDR got elected president. But after he got there, he did so much to lift the country's sights, to use the bully pulpit and his supreme powers of communications to transport the country to a new place. Barack Obama refers to this as a defining moment. That's the title of my book. He gives me some free advertising, although he says he's not going to pay me anything for it. But I don't have to pay him anything for it. But he's right. This is a new defining moment, not all that different from 1933, when we have an opportunity to redefine that social contract. It was said of Franklin Roosevelt that he had a second-class intellect and a first-class temperament. I believe that Barack Obama has a first-class intellect and a first-class temperament. That does not mean that he will be as successful a president necessarily as Franklin Roosevelt, but he has an opportunity to do so if people join him in his call for change. Thank you very much.
It's great to be here today with this distinguished panel. I want to pick up on the themes that both Mr. Sorensen and Mr. Alter have already articulated. Barack Obama is between a rock and a hard place. Progressives trying to squeeze him. He's not profoundly committed to progressive politics. And then you think the last person that was not the president. It's hard to argue for the presence of a political figure whose bona fides are so radically established that he or she is capable of organizing the left and then governing the entire country. That is not an attack on leftist politics and progressive politics. That is a call for progressive politics to get into the real world of governance and the political realities we face before us. We ain't got but two choices. We got some more. We could go Nader and the Congressman, Brother Barr. I say brother advisedly, because I think he's got some brother in him somewhere. But the reality is, for those of us looking at the choices that lay before us, understand that either it is the embrace of an American whose policies and whose political judgment, Senator McCain, a wonderful human being as an individual, continue the rambunctious cowboy politics of an authoritarian president whose anti-democratic furor has wreaked havoc in American society. On the other hand, we've got a calm African-American man who remains calm under pressure. He is, in one sense, a Jackie Robinson figure. Jackie Robinson wasn't necessarily the best black ball player to play. He was the best suited to be the first one to play, because he could take the animus, the recalcitrants, the reactionary white supremacist assault upon him and keep ticking. Barack Obama is cool like that. Not too high, not too low, just right in the middle there. He gives a great speech, and it's hard to be a black man with the ability to talk. Either you can't talk. Boy, I wish these black folk would learn how to talk, and if you learn how to talk, dadgum, he's an elitist. He's too sophisticated. His use of the rhetorical machinations of eloquent speech and declamation undermine his authenticity. Well, dadgum, which one is it? Barack Obama represents, I think, this ideal opportunity, and he has ruffled the feathers within African American circles and within broader white circles, which means he must be doing his job. Black folks said he wasn't black enough because his mama was white and his daddy was African. Oh, I see. He's African. So he's not sufficiently black. African. His daddy is Kenyan. That's not on the south side of Chicago. that is actually in the continent of Africa. But what black people really meant was suspicion and skepticism. What I love about black folk don't just vote for somebody because they black. If that's the case, Colin Powell would have had a great way, and Condoleezza Rice would have tremendous opportunity. But black people, when they saw Barack Obama win in Iowa, they said, hey, that brother looked like he can win, but it ain't before black folk in Iowa. So if he can convince white Americans to follow him, we should join his team. And so now what's interesting is that many white Americans are skeptical. Can he speak to the broad mainstream of working class white America? Is he capable of dealing with the hinterlands and Appalachia? Is he dealing with that ridge of white Americans whose skepticism about the potential for a black man to articulate their vision reigns supreme? Well, the reality is all people speak from their specific standpoints in the universe, and what they're capable of doing is convincing human beings to go along with them in the journey toward communal transformation. And at its best, I think what Barack Obama offers to us is a kind of black Kennedy. You know, John F. Kennedy, there's a book about him on civil rights called The Bystander. Mr. Sorensen might argue with that. 1 minute. Mr. Sorensen might argue with that, but what's interesting is that JFK was an interesting and intriguing human being who understood the politics of governing in a way that made it possible for him to express his vision and for America to catch fire. I think Barack Obama, similarly, is situated to express American ideals more powerfully and more articulately than any other presidential candidate in the last 20 years. That has ruffled the feathers of many, that has caused consternation to some, but if we join with him, I believe we can say those simple words, si se puede, yes we can, and we can join him in taking back this country from the right-wing, recalcitrant, reactionary folk who want to undermine the greatest prospect of American democratic experiment in the 21st century. Thank you.
Take the mic with you. Thank you, sir. Thank you, Ted and Jonathan and Michael. I'd like to ask each of you a quick question and then seek a brief answer before we begin our second panel. Let me start with Ted. I recall that we recently spoke about how the late Arthur Schlesinger Jr. and you had a disagreement about whether Kennedy's Catholicism was a huge political liability in 1960, a small liability, or Schlesinger thought, a small plus. Could you analogize between the second Catholic nominee and the first Catholic president and his difficulties in his candidacy, and the first African-American nominee of a major party in 08?
I think it's probably difficult for people in 2008 to understand or even believe the hate mail that poured into our Kennedy Senate office when he was a candidate for president from anti-Catholic bigots. This is much better. That's the McCain microphone you're getting. And the exit polls in November 1960 showed that the single largest block of votes against Kennedy were from Protestants, many of them, I'm sorry to say, Democrats, lifelong Democrats. And so he had to overcome that prejudice and bigotry. He did, and I'm convinced that the color of a man's skin has even less to do with the way he thinks about public policy than the religious creed to which he belongs, and that there will be no reason at all for anti-black prejudice to hurt the Obama campaign. But given the fact that Kennedy tried to appeal to every reasonable American with his Houston speech and otherwise, and still had all those votes against him, I have to assume we all have to work all the harder to elect Obama.
Thank you, Ted. Michael, we recall how when Dr. King in 1967 and 68 vigorously led the fight against the Vietnam War, a lot of people in the country criticized him because he was a civil rights leader. Why is he doing this? And he came under a lot of attack, and he responded in a certain way. How might Dr. King today advise Barack Obama, who in a different era and on other issues is going to come under sustained personal assault, given the Republican template that has worked in the past, and given the issue and the opponent in 2008? What would Dr. King urge him to do as he comes under these ad hominem assaults in terms of responding?
Well, I think that Senator Obama understands, and Martin Luther King Jr., 40 years hence, I have no doubt, would agree that he faces nothing near what Dr. King faced in his day. The racial animus will be there. I'm not so certain I agree with Mr. Sorensen, a brilliant historical figure and speechwriter. I would just quibble a bit with his ideal is right. I agree with that, but I think that the resistance to Barack Obama for no other reason than he's a black man shows in the polls right now. If he was a white guy, he'd be up by 20 points. There's just, and I'm not suggesting that the only issue is race, because it isn't. But a good-looking, articulate, intelligent, fresh, clean black man with his bona fides and authenticity and his resonance and his speech making and why ain't he up by a lot more? Because there's a tug and a resistance against what he represents. But to his credit, he has not exploited that racial animus in his favor and has sought to unify the nation. Dr. King would tell him to continue to do that, but his problem might be Dr. King himself, not what Dr. King would recommend. Many people think that when Jeremiah Wright spoke out against America as he did, that he was antithetical to Dr. King and Barack Obama was king. No, Barack Obama is Martin Luther King Jr. up until 1963, 65. Jeremiah Wright may be king from 65 on. King, remember, gave his last sermon in the Washington Cathedral, where he was very critical of economic injustice as well as Vietnam. And in his pocket, the night he was murdered, was a sermon for the next Sunday entitled Why America May Go to Hell. Many people forget that Martin Luther King Jr. might have been resisted by a political candidate like Barack Obama and might have been a liability and not an asset. So I think Dr. King would encourage Barack Obama to stay the course, do what he's doing, continue to aim for the high road, and Americans will congregate around him in a very serious fashion.
Thank you. If you could pass the mic to Jonathan Alter. Jonathan, in your remarks, you commented on how differently Roosevelt governed from how he campaigned. Clearly, in 1932 and 1933, events were in the saddle with the Depression. The question is, and Rachel Maddow made reference to one of the next panelists, John Podesta, and I are trying to funnel the best ideas and experience of the public interest and progressive and labor communities into a civilian transition book for the 44th president. How could Barack Obama campaign somewhat better now, before the election, so he can claim a mandate later in 2009?
I'm not really that big on the whole mandate thing. I think you just have to win. And what worries me is that I think Obama needs about a 5-point margin in the polls going in, or he's going to lose because of racism. JFK won very, very narrowly in 1960. Maybe that hampered him in getting some things done. Obviously, it helps to win bigger. The most important thing, though, is getting that number of Democratic senators up closer to 60 so that you can get your program through Congress. And so that's why all this talk you hear about the Senate is so important. So it's less the margin than it is getting the votes for it. And I think Obama does need to be more specific, especially more what I call sticky specific. In other words, with a metaphor or some Sorensonian line in his speech on Thursday night that the American people can actually remember, that people who don't pay a lot of attention to can get their hands around. A metaphor. I don't have it, but I hope they're coming up with it, because most Americans don't know what he's going to do for them, and they don't go to his website to find out. So that's much more important than worrying about whether the vote totals actually give him a mandate for this or that small policy proposal. It's an overall sense of direction that he needs that mandate.
Please, everybody, thank Jonathan Alter, Ted Sorensen, Michael Eric Dyson. Some of them will be signing their books in the tattered cover next door. And as the second panel comes forward, moderated by Tom Hartman, who I've already introduced, with John Podesta, Ariana Huffington, Paul Krugman, and David Sirota, who will be introduced by Tom Hartman. I'd like to ask Charlie Kirker, who is the chairman and majority owner of Air America, to come forward to say hi, as will Elizabeth Wagley, between panels 2 or 3. Please welcome my boss and the person without whom Air America wouldn't exist, to fight the Limbaughs, the Hannitys, the Savages, and all the Savages, Charlie Kirker.
Thank you all for being here today, for braving the traffic, for braving the heat. We appreciate your presence. We've got 2 more great panels coming up. I'd like to briefly give credit where credit is due to the Green Mountain Coffee Roasters Foundation, which has provided sponsorship backing for these panels today, and in fact will be providing coffee for the bloggers all week in the 3rd floor lounge of the adjacent building. So it's a great progressive company based in Vermont, going national, Green Mountain Coffee Roasters. The next panel, as Mark said, has a focus on the present day, and the 3rd panel will be on the future. And Elizabeth Wagley of the Progressive Book Club will do the transition between the 2nd and the 3rd panel. We are urging people in the back to come forward so that we fill in the ranks here. There are empty seats in the front half of the room. And while the new panelists are coming up, I'd like to just say that Air America is alive. We're growing again, and we look forward to your support. AirAmerica.com allows you to listen to all of our programming, and we are going to be introducing some new shows and new projects in the weeks and months ahead, so I hope you'll pay attention. Tom Hartman is one of our finest hosts. In fact, he is our highest rated host, and he is based in Portland, Oregon. He has indefatigable energy. He does a morning show in Portland in addition to 3 hours every day for Air America. He started this on his own in 2003 in Vermont, and he was one of the first progressive talkers. So I'd like to thank Tom for joining us in his 4th gig of today, if I'm not mistaken. And to please come up, Tom, and you will then be able to introduce the panel. If Tom wants to high jump up onto the stage, there we go. Terrific. Thank you.
Thank you. Hey, David. You were supposed to be on my radio show today. Do you mind moving down and let me sit here so I can play moderator? Thanks. Oh, unless you're bringing another chair? Okay. There you go, David. It's yours again. Okay. Yeah. Ariana's not here, right? I don't think so. Okay. All right. She'll make a dramatic entrance. She'll be fashionably late. Me. Well, in your first panel, you heard not so much the voices of the past. I don't want to frame it quite like that, but the foundations. You know, where have we been? How has it come to here? And in the next panel, we'll be talking about where are we going forward, and you know, what are the visions for the future of America? But in this panel, I'd like to get into where are we now? What is the present? What are the battles that are being fought, essentially? Perhaps an appropriate, perhaps an inappropriate metaphor, between left and right, and even left and right. I just finished debating Dennis Prager, and he kept yelling, "You leftists!" And I was like, "I'm sorry, Dennis. The left is dead." I had the president of the Communist Party of the United States of America on my show last year. He has 312 members. The left is gone. What you have is all of America who want things like Social Security and unions and stuff like that, and then you got a bunch of right-wing cranks. You know, quit calling all of America the left. I wasn't all that excited to hear that, but anyway. So, let's talk about where we're at right now. Each of our guests, each of our panelists will have 5 minutes or so. Is that you're doing the timing? Who's doing the timing? Mark is doing the timing. Each of our panelists will have about 5 minutes to speak, 5 to 7 minutes to speak, and then I'll ask 1 or 2 follow-up questions, and then we'll wrap the thing up. And so let me just introduce. Shall I introduce all? I think I'll introduce all 3 of you, and then I'll. So first, next to me, my friend David Sirota is a political journalist, nationally syndicated newspaper columnist. Most recently, his new book, The Uprising, an unauthorized tour of the populist revolt scaring Wall Street and Washington. Please welcome David Sirota. Please, round of applause for David Sirota. Paul Krugman. Last time I saw you, Paul, was on a cruise ship, and you were not feeling all that. Yeah, you're sick as a dog. But it's great to see you hale and hearty. Paul is a twice-weekly columnist at the New York Times, a professor of economics and international affairs at Princeton University, the author of several books, including his most recent, The Conscience of a Liberal. Paul Krugman. And John Podesta, one of my heroes, the work that you've done putting together the Center for American Progress, one of the resources that I use every single day, and credit frequently but not probably often enough. The president and center for the Center for American Progress. He served as chief of staff to President Clinton in the administration's final 2 years and is the author of this month's The Power of Progress, How American Progressives Can, once again, Save Our Economy, Our Climate, and Our Country. John Podesta. So let me start with you, John. Where are we at right now? What is the battlefield, to use that metaphor, or feel free to reinvent the metaphor if you want to use a different one? What is the state of left versus right?
Well, I think that the American public has experienced 8 years of failed conservative governance, and I think if you look at that across the board, Bush basically got all the big stuff wrong. The economy, with respect to where they want to go, is, hi Ariana, Ariana Huffington, everybody. I think in particular terms, I think that the program that Bush put forward has really not worked for the working people of America. Weekly wages are down, family income's down. That's at an all-time high.
First panel.
We're experiencing an energy crisis today. I think we're going to experience an even greater crisis as a result of global warming in the future. One of the things that I think is of concern is that I think that people have lost faith in the ability of government to really function and move the country in a positive direction, in a progressive direction. And that's why actually I decided to write this book, which was to trace the history of activism of people at the turn of the last century who got involved in challenging a context in which both the workers were being abused, but the great social injustice of the Gilded Age was rampant. And people decided that they needed to get involved. It's happened at the grassroots. It percolated up, sort of resonance with what David's been writing about as he's been traveling the country. It percolated up through ideas at the mayoral level and by governors, ultimately married in the national project of the New Deal and Franklin Roosevelt's administration. And it changed the country, and it built the great middle class. It expanded opportunity for all. Progressives got some things wrong. It took them a while to get the race question right, but ultimately they, it was always progressive politics, progressive leadership, progressive activism that, again, I think made the country great, created the American dream. I trace my own roots to that in the book, and I think today the challenges are different. They're global in nature. How are people going to survive and thrive in a global economy that's put great pressure on the American middle class? How are we going to deal with the healthcare crisis? How are we going to deal with an international security architecture that begins to incorporate, I think, the ideas and thinking of bringing the world together, if you will, rather than blowing it apart. So the challenge of picking up the pieces from the conservative failure of the past 8 years and the conservative promise of more of the same, I skipped over, as I said, the global energy crisis that we face and the one that we will face with respect to dealing with really the profound economic and security challenges of global warming. That's, I think, what this campaign's about. It's about two people, but it's about two very different philosophies of governing and two very different foci of how one really approaches even the decision to try to use government as an instrument to expand opportunity, to support the common good versus special interests, to again rethink and rebuild the international architecture to create a better security platform. I think that Barack Obama is a great standard bearer for that. I think Biden was a good choice to run alongside him. May have some disagreement of that on the panel, but I think that ultimately it's really about two different governing philosophies that's at stake, and that goes top and down the ballot and out into people who are social activists in their own communities. And I'm excited because I think the American public, while they're dispirited by the failures of government, I think they're ready for a new progressive moment. And so I think this is a really special year. So I'll turn it back to you.
Well, very well said, John. Welcome, Ariana.
Thank you.
You not only look marvelous, you smell great. It's a marvelous perfume. I love it. Ariana Huffington is the co-founder and the editor-in-chief of the Huffington Post. She's the author of several books, including this year's Right is Wrong, How the Lunatic Fringe hijacked America, shredded the Constitution, and made us all less safe. And so let's welcome, first of all, Ariana. And what we're doing by way of format is each person is speaking for 5 to 7 minutes. You'll get your time cues here or here, right here. And then I'll follow up with some questions. John went first. We'll go to you next. I just introduced you.
I was told I have to change chairs, so excuse me. Oh, so that I can look at Mark, I can understand. So first of all, thank you so much for having me here. I hope you can all hear me because you have to deal with my Greek accent. Can you all hear me okay? So I agree with everything John said. I just feel increasingly that the way we define... Oh, I don't need the mic.